For decades, the story of the Eagles has been about more than just music. Sure, they were the golden boys of California rock who gave us a sound that defined a generation. But behind the harmonies and diamond-certified albums, there's always been another story, one of conflict, clashing egos, and epic turmoil. And at the heart of it all is one of the most talked-about relationships in rock history: the dynamic between the band's wild-card guitar genius, Joe Walsh, and its intense, perfectionist leader, Don Henley. For years, we've heard the rumors of bitter rivalries and creative battles. Were they brothers in arms bound by music? Or were they just resentful colleagues who could barely stand each other? Was it a brotherhood, or just a business deal held together by Platinum Records? The real story has been buried for decades under myths and media spin. But now, at 77, Joe Walsh is finally setting the record straight. What really went down behind the closed doors of the studio and on those sold-out stages? The answer is a lot more surprising and a whole lot more human than you think. To get the friction and the magic between Joe Walsh and Don Henley, you have to understand where they came from. They were polar opposites, destined to either fly apart or snap together with incredible force. First, you had Don Henley. By the mid-70s, Henley was already rock royalty in the making. As a founding member of the Eagles, he was the drummer, lead singer, and with Glenn Frey, the band's chief songwriter and visionary. Henley was a perfectionist, part poet, part businessman. He was driven, meticulous, and fiercely protective of the Eagles' sound, that clean, harmony-drenched blend of country and rock he and Frey had built from the ground up. Henley wasn't just in a band. He was building an empire, and he had zero patience for chaos or surprises. And then there was Joe Walsh. Joe Walsh was nothing but a surprise. He was the clown prince of rock, a guitar god whose talent was matched only by his reputation for pure mayhem. As the frontman for the James Gang and a successful solo artist, Walsh was the exact opposite of the Eagles' cool, collected image. He was a wild man, an unpredictable force known for his goofy humor and a raw, aggressive guitar style. While the Eagles were crafting thoughtful ballads, Walsh was cranking out anthems like Rocky Mountain Way, loud, gritty, swaggering rock and roll. By 1975, the Eagles were at a crossroads. They were huge, but founding member Bernie Leadon was out, tired of the band's move toward harder rock. Henley and Frey knew they needed to evolve. To get edgier, they needed a gunslinger, and their manager, Irving Azoff, also happened to manage Joe Walsh. On paper, it made no sense. It was like inviting a hurricane to a garden party. How could this agent of chaos possibly fit into the tightly controlled world of the Eagles? It was a massive gamble that could either tear the band apart or launch them into the stratosphere. When Joe Walsh joined the Eagles in late 1975, it wasn't just a lineup change, it was a culture shock. Inside the band, especially with Don Henley, the vibe was skeptical. Henley, the guardian of the Eagles' sound, was seriously wary of Walsh's reputation. He saw him as a loose cannon whose explosive style could shatter the delicate, pristine sound that was their trademark. This wasn't just about music, it was a clash of work ethics. Henley and Frey built songs like surgeons with precision and planning. Walsh, on the other hand, was an artist who painted with a firehose-all instinct and raw feeling. In a recent interview, Walsh perfectly summed up their dynamic. I'd walk into the studio barefoot with a joke, and Don would be there with a notebook and a schedule. The real test came during the recording of Hotel California. The studio became a pressure cooker where these two opposing forces would either create brilliance or just explode. The album took a grueling year and a half, pushing every single member to their absolute limit. You can hear that tension in one of their biggest rock hits, Life in the Fast Lane. The song started with a classic Joe Walsh moment. He was just warming up, playing this frantic, killer guitar riff he'd been messing with. It was pure Walsh, aggressive, catchy, and dripping with swagger. Glenn Frey heard it and knew it was gold, but Henley wasn't so sure. The riff was miles away from the polished Eagles sound. It was raw, messy. It was wild. According to Walsh, turning that riff into a finished Eagles song was a battle that dragged on for weeks. Henley, the lyricist, had to figure out how to tame the wild energy of Walsh's guitar and shape it into a story that fit the album's dark themes. Walsh later admitted, "Without Don, the song would have been just another rock track." He added a depth I hadn't thought of. Henley's meticulous focus took Walsh's raw power and gave it a purpose. The result was a monster hit that cemented Walsh's place in the band, but it also set the stage for their relationship for years to come. It was a partnership that thrived on conflict. Henley the strategist and Walsh the warrior would circle each other, pushing and challenging, often to the breaking point. But somewhere in that space between them, they found magic. As Walsh himself said, that mix, that tension, that's where the magic happened. It was a tough, often painful process, but it's what turned the Eagles from a great band into arguably the biggest American rock band of their time. As the Eagles soared to the top of the rock world after Hotel California, the pressure inside the band became almost unbearable. They weren't just a band anymore. They were a global brand, a multi-million-dollar machine, and that weight fell squarely on its leaders. This era, from the late 70s until they crashed and burned in 1980, was the eye of the hurricane of time, of massive success and deep personal turmoil, where the differences between Henley and Walsh were pushed to the absolute limit. Walsh has been very clear that he saw Henley as the driving mind of the Eagles. Henley wasn't just the singer and drummer. He was the CEO, the guy poring over lyrics, scrutinizing mixes, and making the tough decisions. Walsh said it with understanding, not resentment. Don carried the heaviest load. He was writing, singing, and trying to keep us from falling apart. This shows Henley not as a tyrant, but as a man under suffocating pressure, trying to steer a ship while half the crew was partying. And by his own admission, Joe Walsh was leading that party. As the band's fame exploded, his struggles with drugs and alcohol spiraled out of control. The wild man persona that was so electric on stage started taking over his life. In the History of the Eagles documentary, Henley noted, "Joe wasn't malicious, but his lack of control made it nearly impossible for us to keep going." Walsh himself has been brutally honest about it. "I became about as alcoholic and drug-dependent as someone can be," he said, confessing he doesn't even remember how he survived it. This created a toxic cycle. The more chaotic things got, the tighter Henley gripped the reins, becoming more demanding. The more pressure Walsh felt, the further he retreated into his addictions. While the rumors about them fighting over Stevie Nicks were just that, rumors which Walsh has debunked, the studio was a battleground. As Glenn Frey put it, Don doesn't like personal drama getting in the way of business. Joe's the opposite. He lives like it's a party. The final straw came in July 1980 at the infamous Long Night at Wrong Beach concert. On stage, Glenn Frey and Don Felder were literally threatening each other between songs. Walsh, admitting he was drunk, tried to lighten the mood, which only made things worse. Henley, desperately trying to hold the show together, shot daggers at Walsh, later blaming his antics for deepening the rift. The brotherhood was shattered. The machine had finally ground to a halt, consumed by its own success. It was the end of an era and the start of a long, cold silence. The Eagles' 1980 implosion wasn't a quiet split. It was a nasty divorce. After the onstage meltdown in Long Beach, they slapped together a live album to satisfy their contract and then walked away without looking back. For the next 14 years, the Eagles were over. In the aftermath, a lot of Don Henley's anger was reportedly aimed right at Joe Walsh, from Henley's point of view. Walsh's addictions had Beck, an anchor dragging the whole ship down, but here's the twist, and it's a big one. What's amazing isn't Henley's anger, it's that years later Joe Walsh completely understood it. There's no bitterness in his memory, no settling scores, instead there's empathy. In one of the most revealing quotes about their relationship, Walsh said, "He was writing, singing, and trying to keep us from falling apart. I understand why he got mad." That single sentence tells you everything. It shows that underneath all the fighting, Walsh had a deep respect for the burden Henley was carrying. He knew he was part of the problem during the 14-year vacation. As Henley called it, they all went their separate ways. Henley became a huge solo star. Walsh continued making music, though his addictions hampered him through much of the 80s. They were living in different worlds, but something quiet and totally unexpected was happening behind the scenes. The business partnership was dead, but a thin, personal thread remained. Walsh revealed that during those silent years, Don Henley would call him every now and then just to check in. They never talked about the band, never talked business. It was just one guy asking another how he was doing. For Walsh, those calls were a lifeline. He recalled, "Don didn't say it out loud, but I knew he still cared about me. This small detail changes everything." The public saw Henley as the cold, calculating leader who put the brand first. But these private calls show a different side. A loyal friend watching from a distance as a man he respected battled his demons. It proves that even when the Eagles were just a toxic memory, the personal bond between Don Henley and Joe Walsh was still there. It wasn't a rivalry that defined their time apart, but a quiet concern, a prelude to the one act of loyalty that would finally bring them back together. Section 5. Following action and resolution. Hell freezes over when the Eagles reunited in 1994 for the Hell Freezes Over tour. It was more than a comeback. For Joe Walsh, it was a moment that saved his life. The reunion came with one non-negotiable condition, an ultimatum from Don Henley and Glenn Frey. They told Walsh point blank, "If you want back in, you have to get sober." Walsh described the meeting in the History of the Eagles documentary. Don looked me straight in the eye and said, "Joe, either you get sober or there's no place for you in the Eagles." No negotiations, no exceptions. This wasn't just a business move to make sure the tour ran smoothly. It was an act of tough love from the only two people on the planet he might actually listen to. And Henley didn't just stop at words. He personally took Walsh to a rehab center. It was the turning point. It worked. Walsh got clean and has been sober ever since. His gratitude is immense, and it completely reframes his relationship with Henley. "They saved my life, without a doubt," Walsh has stated. "I owe them the world." The man whose intensity was once a source of conflict became the man whose unyielding standards literally pulled Walsh back from the edge. As Glenn Frey once said, "Don's tough because he cares." He wasn't going to let Joe destroy himself. But the story doesn't end there in a neat little bow. Their dynamic was, as always, complicated. Even after this life-saving act of friendship, the business side of the Eagles remained a source of tension. Walsh has revealed that the reunited Eagles were run even more tightly by Henley and Frey. He reportedly believed he'd been promised an equal share of the tour profits, only to find out he was getting a flat fee. He saw it as a betrayal, another case where the idea of brotherhood clashed with the cold, hard facts of the band's corporate structure. And yet, despite feeling betrayed, Walsh chose to stay quiet. He didn't escalate. He decided his loyalty to the band and the peace they'd found was more important than the money. And what he did next says everything you need to know about Joe Walsh, the wild man of rock. The iconoclast ultimately valued the relationships and the music more than the paycheck. Theirs was never a perfect friendship. It was a messy, complicated, and often contradictory story marked by genius, demons, life-saving interventions, and business disputes. The resolution wasn't that the conflict vanished, but that a deeper, life-altering respect had finally taken hold. So, what's the final truth about the long and winding road of Joe Walsh and Don Henley? At 77, the picture Joe Walsh paints isn't one of a simple feud. It's far more complex, a story woven with threads of conflict and devotion, frustration and deep gratitude. It was never just fire versus ice, the wild man versus the perfectionist. It was the story of how those two opposing forces created a friction that gave us some of the greatest rock anthems ever recorded. Their journey was a turbulent saga of creative battles, personality clashes, a painful breakup, and a quiet connection that survived the silence. But ultimately, it's a story of reconciliation, not just for a tour, but for a life. The same man Joe Walsh saw as a controlling boss became the man he credits with saving him. That's the heart of their bond, a respect so deep it could deliver the hardest truths and the greatest acts of loyalty. In the end, it's not about who won the arguments. It's about the complicated, messy, beautiful relationships that powered one of the greatest bands in rock history. Looking back, Joe Walsh isn't holding on to old grudges. He's holding on to gratitude. He and Don Henley were never just enemies, and they were never just friends. They were brothers, flawed, fiery, and forever linked by the music that changed the world, and by a bond that was strong enough to save a soul. What do you think about this complex relationship? Does Joe Walsh's side of the story change how you see the Eagles? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you love deep dives into the stories behind the music, be sure to share this with your friends and subscribe for more. Because in the world of classic rock, there are always more secrets to uncover.